Someday Angeline by Louis Sachar, Chapter 15, otherwise known as Mr. Bone. Abel offered to walk Melissa out to her car. She said it wasn't necessary, but he insisted. I don't know how safe the streets are this time of night, he said. They didn't speak or even look at each other as they rode down in the elevator. Elevators do that to people, but once outside in the cool night air, Abel finally asked the question he had wanted to ask all night. Melissa, why do you call yourself Mr. Bone? She wasn't sure she understood his question. At school, she replied, the students are not supposed to call their teachers by their first names, although I really wouldn't mind if they wanted to call me Melissa. He wasn't sure he understood her answer. No. Why Mr.? He asked. What? Why Mr. Bone? Why not Miss Bone? Miss Bone, she questioned. Mr. Bone. She looked at him with utter astonishment. Mr. Bone, she repeated. Mr. Bone, she exclaimed. She laughed so hard she had to grab his arm to steady herself. Abel didn't know what to think. Does Angeline call me Mr. Bone? She asked. She couldn't believe it. Yes, said Abel. He felt embarrassed but didn't know why. And you call me Mr. Bone too? She asked. He shrugged. I guess you answered to it. She laughed again and buried her face in his shoulder. He wished he knew what was so funny. Just for a moment, she felt like kissing him. Instead, she squeezed his arm. Abel, she said, my name is Melissa Turbone, otherwise known as Miss. She paused for emphasis. Turbone. Her mouth dropped open just then. When she had said her name, even with the pause for emphasis, it did sound to her like she said Mr. Bone. You know you're right, she remarked. No matter how you try to say it, it still comes out Mr. Bone. See, said Abel. I never noticed that before. Now I'll never be able to say Mr. Bone again. Ah! She screamed and quickly covered her mouth with her hand. What I just said, Abel, it sounded like Mr. Bone, didn't it? He smiled and nodded. Oh my, said Melissa. They reached her yellow car with the bumper sticker on the back that said Save the Whales. She got in. Well, it was very nice meeting you, Abel. Nice meeting you, Abel smiled. Mr. Bone. She winked at him, then drove off. He walked back to his apartment whistling. Melissa Turbone, he thought. That's a nice name, too. When he got upstairs, both he and Angela suddenly realized that they were starving. And that's the end of Chapter 15.